Hello, my name is Randolph South, and this is my video about underpainting. I start with a strong drawing, of course, transfer it onto the canvas, and then I cover the surface with turpentine, burnt sienna, and a bit of raw sienna mixed, and I sort of loosely put that all over the canvas. It's like give me a starting place. So I'm roughing that in. Then I use a slightly dry brush. This has turpentine on it, and I'm using this and I'm dabbing it on my paper towels, and I'm pulling the pigment back and modeling the pigment to give me kind of mold and give a 3D shape to the figures here. Having the drawing show through is very important. I use charcoal, and it seems to work fairly well. It preserves my drawing so I can see it through the transparency of the wash. I first learned of this technique about 40 years ago when I studied with an artist named Craig Butler, and he introduced this. He called it scumbling, but scumbling has a different meaning now. And I've never been able to find a satisfactory definition for this technique other than basic underpainting. I was in Europe and I saw some paintings by David, the neoclassicist, and they were unfinished, and I discovered this was a technique that he used to lay out he had his very detailed drawings, but then there were washes, and then there were also the underpainting in it, and he had manipulated that and almost molded the characters so that it really, then he would glaze on top of it. He would have all of his basic modeling done. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the way the sun hits the dogs' faces. These two dogs are my niece Jade's, and they're got a lot of personality. And I'm using a photograph of them because dogs don't pose. They are not patient. So they were sitting or they were right by a window where there were blinds, and streaks of light were coming in that sort of struck them, but it's like there was also a strong sunlight. It's almost like the golden hour kind of look, but not quite. But here I'm going in and I'm preserving, I want to show the rhythm and the texture of their fur. They're older dogs, and so they're a little scruffy, but that's a wonderful rhythm to their fur. And it's like the color, like some, getting a little more white in the muzzle as they got older. But big, beautiful eyes and very friendly, full of personality. So here I'm continuing to pull up those highlights. And at the same time, I'm pushing the burnt sienna to mold and model the shapes, the basic shapes that are part of them. But I want to have that brush texture, so it's I want to keep that rhythm and keep the flow of it, because I've seen some artists paint every hair on an animal, and I'm going, well, so that's great, but it just it's sort of lifeless, and it looks like the technique overwhelmed the communication of the painting. I'd rather show their personality and what sweethearts they are than to show a super photoreal portrait of an animal. I think a photograph certainly will do that. Let's leave it to photographers. So I'm going in here, and the sunlight streamed across the backs and the heads in stripes, which gave these a lot of drama and interest that if they were just lit, by an open window. It reminds me of I don't know if anyone knows about Tony Scott, the director. He used to love light through Venetian blinds. It's sort of like that dramatic sort of film noir sort of look. But in his case, they are more contemporary, the skinny blinds. That was all about the 80s. So here I'm going in, and I'm dabbing my brush on the paper towel as when I really want to pull up the highlights, I'll pull more pigment out. And I'm seeing where the sunlight is hitting the animals. On the chest here, and the structure that dogs' bodies have, the rib cage here and the shoulders that are so different from humans. And but still, like keeping the that rhythm of the hair, the fur of the dogs. Like I want to make sure that I get that directional sort of thing looking correct, and also a sort of tapered look. More of the same here, like pulling in, it's like giving me the texture. It's funny because using a brush to make sort of like brushy hair shapes. And then I'm like smoothing out some areas and like where I want less texture. And now I'm looking at like the light hits the left side of their faces, necks, and bodies. And I want to model like, under the neck, like where are the lightest parts of the color of the fur, but also where the sunlight is hitting. And then, as I'm moving along, I've found more of these highlights. Like sometimes I'll let this sit for a day to dry a little bit, and it gives me an option of going in and like, putting more in detail. Like here, I've gone and I've modeled a little bit more, but I'm still pulling at those highlights. I'm using a slightly smaller brush now because I want to keep that sort of fur kind of texture, because like the light's hitting across the top of his head here, and you'll see as I move along there's more of that. And I like that transparency because it gives me like the light bouncing through transparent colors. This is more alive than like I know a lot of artists love to paint wet on wet, and that's fine. It's just it's my way of doing it, because like drawing is my first love, so it's like drawing with brushes here. Now here my next step is to take Payne's gray, and I go in and I sort of like add the darker colors. I avoid black until the very end, which I may use black for the pupil of the eye, but that's about it. And here I'm like putting in the areas where there's less light hitting, and I'm using a small oil slanted brush, and I want to keep that taper of the fur, that sort of feel of fur of the animal. Like, and here I'm like, this is using the Payne's gray with maybe a touch of raw sienna or burnt sienna in it. I may use umber occasionally, but it sort of like flattens out everything. I want to keep this liveness and transparency. So I'm painting here and keeping that just trying to turn the shape, because if you look at modeling, like everything's basically, you could say, it's like at least humans or animals are spherical. So there's a highlight side, there's a medium tone, and then there's the gray dry side, darker side. So here I'm just looking at my reference of the dogs, and just trying to like lay in that more detail that I maybe pulled out with the early stages, giving it a fur sort of look. And here I've moved along. Now I'm laying in some raw sienna and titanium white to give me more define of the fur of the highlights, while maintaining the transparency. I like to use a gel medium with these highlighted colors. So you can see on the dog's face there, it's like I want to keep those strokes and rhythms in there, because it's like the rhythm of visually, the rhythms are the convincing part. And the gel medium lets me keep some of the glazing transparency. And I'm using my mouse stick because, you know, it's wet. It's still wet. You know, it's still wet on wet. It's just a different take of wet on wet. So I'm like, I want to have a gradation in the fur, like here where the ridge of the eye socket and then the hollow of the cheeks. And then what's, you know, making that look natural. And as it, you know, goes from dark to light, it kind of turns the cheekbone. I guess that's what you call a dog. And here I'm like blending these in. And it's like I want to keep that fur look to it. So I want to keep that gradation there. It's like that's an interesting part of the animal. And color, and I said he before. She, I think that's a female. I can't remember if they're females or males, but they're certainly funny dogs and like very interesting dogs. And here I'm working on the ear because the interior. This is towards the end of like painting the dogs. I haven't put the final highlights on. But I'm putting in the background, this is an indigo with titanium white and the gel medium. And I like to model this sort of like the neo-realist painters did the sort of, you always see the brushwork, you know, showing through, like Courbet, who's another one of my favorite painters. It's like, you can always see what he's doing with his brush. It is a painting, by the way, so it's like, let's show how it was done. And here I'm like filling in more of that indigo. I did one layer of titanium and now I'm going in and modeling with a little more of a darker color. There may be, I like to mix my blues to give it some transparency and depth. There may be a little bit of phthalo, but mostly this is indigo, which is like a nice neutral color. I wanted the background to be more neutral, but have some color in it so that the focus is on the dogs. Also, I'm using a round brush. I don't want sharp edges. I want these to sort of blend together so that it gives it a softer kind of edge. And here I've laid in where the sun was from the blind streaming in. And I'm going into with Payne's gray and just a tiny touch of ivory black. And I'm defining the eyes a bit more because I want them to have that big wet appearance that dog eyes have. And probably the darkest black on the whole painting is in the pupil of the eyes. But it turns them and makes them look a little more round in shape. Also, I used the Payne's gray on the nose with a touch of black there too, and then some modeling in with, also I forgot to add, I'm using also an Indian yellow and a lot of the tone on the fur mixed with the raw sienna. It's funny, I always wondered about burnt sienna and raw sienna, and I was in Siena a few years ago. I was looking at the dirt and yes, that's the color, it's raw sienna, which is fascinating. Those are the pigments they were using, so that's how they got their name. The nostrils are also a very dark part, not quite as dark as the pupil. But going in with the other dog now, and it's like really defining those eyes and giving them, it gives them the depth. This technique of painting actually helps me get the depth that I want because I don't want this flat at all. I want to, I'm not going for realism, but I want them to look like my view. And like the dog there has her chin on it's by a bed, so it's like I want to see the imprint of the light streaming across there too. So that's my technique. Thank you for checking me out, and I'd love to hear some feedback. So if you have any comments, please leave them below. Thank you.